Simon Hart.
Thank you, Mrs. Reardon. And could I join in the congratulations to the Honourable Member for Sleaford and North Hykeham in securing this debate. I think it's always encouraging to have any discussion in this building about the plight of rural communities, and in particular agricultural aspects to that. If I may, I'd like to start on some of the economic context which the Honourable Member mentioned, and really just to quote some figures. And I do this as a brother-in-law of a dairy farmer, as the son of a dairy farmer, as the husband of a dairy farmer's daughter. So you can get a general idea of the sort of position that I'm coming from. But at the moment, and this is admittedly only one, farmers are producing milk at anything between 1 and 2.5p per litre loss. The dairies are selling their product for something in the region of a 4 to 5p profit. And yet certain supermarkets, and I shall try and be careful about naming some, if not all of them, are actually selling at 22p a litre profit. That is the economic context which the Honourable Gentleman mentioned, and which I absolutely agree with him, would be greeted with a certain amount of disdain and indeed disgust if the buying public was aware of the muscle that was being applied. If I can take it a stage further too, there is one particular supermarket which prides itself on paying its suppliers a rather higher price, something in the region of 28p a litre. And yet, if the truth was known, which is actually there are only 800 suppliers of that particular supermarket, something around the region of 10%, who actually qualify for that price, then I think the public would raise an eyebrow. In addition to that, the supermarket in question does not actually fork out that extra amount itself. What it did was insist on the middleman, the dairy, actually negotiating a more stringent price with the supplier. So what did the dairy do? The dairy actually froze its payments to farmers who are not providing that particular supermarket, which in turn consequentially meant that they had a reduction in their price. So whilst the supermarket is obtaining good public relations, if you like, for distributing press releases talking about fair trade for farmers, it in fact has not been impacted on at all. And yet all of those farmers who are not lucky enough to provide that particular supermarket chain have been penalised as a consequence. So that is the actual and factual economic context which lies behind this important debate. And this is why, and I don't think there is any other reason at all, that we are looking at the prospect of super dairies, if that's the right expression. But I do also want to inject, if I may, Mrs. Reardon, a degree of sort of measured sort of middle ground, if I may, if I can. It is quite obvious that increasingly farmers are recognising that scale is the only way in which they can make money. And I'm not talking about making large sums of money. I'm talking about actually making sufficient money not to go bust, making sufficient money to be able to invest in the type of new technology which is not just desirable but actually required by law in milk production in the current economic and legal climate. It is also, I think, obvious, and I represent an area of West Wales in Carmarthenshire, probably one of the highest milk-producing areas in the UK, where there is a significant problem of TB in cattle. That, again, is fortunately a debate for another day, but there is an attraction, I'm aware, from constituents of mine to housing cattle indoors as far as it is possible to do so, because it reduces the risk of infection of TB. It enables them, too, to bulk buy feed and other bedding materials, and feed in particular, as honourable members will be aware, has never been more expensive than it is this year. It is also quite clear that this sort of scale production reduces the chances of pollution, and we are all aware, sadly, of the incidences of pollution as a consequence of leaking slurry tanks and the like over the years. That has fortunately come down, but one of the reasons it's come down is because of housing measures which people have put in place and are increasingly under pressure to put in place. There is an argument, whether it's proven or not, that indoor milk production reduces the carbon footprint of the particular institutions, particular farms. Whether that's a compelling argument, others I have no doubt will expand. And of course there is the argument too, all against, it's not saying this is, I'm not trying to justify or promote large-scale dairy production. I'm simply trying to set out what my milk-producing constituents see as a sort of central consequence of the supermarket grip on the industry. But they also see it as much more likely that they can invest decent sums of money in the sort of modern technology we've heard about, anaerobic digesters, than they would be able to do under any other system. Indeed, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I think he's generating a very interesting point of view, which is that we need in this country to have a whole range, really, of dairy farms, from some that are small and medium to some that are rather larger. But we've already heard from the honourable gentleman who initiated this debate that there is a code for welfare for dairy animals. But it may be that the ones kept in larger units might need a different approach in terms of the code of welfare, because they will be kept in different circumstances.
Thank you, Mrs. Reardon. I agree with the honourable member for Brecon and Radnor, and of course there's no greater expert on this particular subject. I do want to come back to the welfare concerns, actually, and the honourable member for Stoke-on-Trent made an interesting intervention about whether this would encourage dairy production to move from its sort of traditional countryside location to more brownfield sites. Whilst I think there is a danger of that, I'm not as convinced as perhaps he is, because there, of course, is more to dairy farming than milking cows. There is young stock, there are dry cows, there are animals which are sick and lame, which cannot be housed indoors. And so there will always be a need for animals in green fields, if I can put it that way. So I don't think we want to assume that this is the only part of the process, and therefore it can be located anywhere in the UK. It's not quite as, I would argue at any rate, as simple as that. But if I may, Mrs. Reardon, because I don't want to make a lengthy contribution, just return to finish to the discussion which was going on earlier about welfare. And I always think when we have discussions about animal welfare in this kind of context, there is a huge gulf of difference between reality and perception. And the honourable member referred to legitimate concerns, and I'm always very wary of legitimate concerns unless they can be backed up by evidence. And I know that the department is currently assessing the welfare implications of indoor cattle, and I think we would be well advised as members, particularly members representing agricultural areas, to be a little cautious about talking about legitimate concerns until we know that there are legitimate concerns to be cautious about. And it's again, I think, very important that if we're looking at scale in terms of milk production, that actually these bigger herds do have the ability to segregate cattle which may be thin, which may be lame, which may be suffering from some kind of illness, which in normal circumstances, in small-scale production, can be prone to bullying by other animals in the herd. And by being able to do these things at a larger scale, actually there is an argument, unproven, I fully accept, there is an argument that welfare standards can in fact be improved. In other words, big is not necessarily bad, and I suspect we are all aware of small dairy producers, the sort which we are trying to champion, whose welfare standards are actually not as good as perhaps those larger, slightly more, to use the rather unattractive phrase, industrial units. So we just have to be really cautious, I believe, about simply assuming, not suggesting for one moment honourable members are, but being led by the nose down the road which says that big is bad and that the only kind of high welfare milk production is that which is undertaken by small producers. We know it isn't the case, and we need to have evidence to hand before we start making judgments such as that. I welcome the debate. I think it's one which has been waiting to be heard. I think it's one which has huge consequences for the rural economy. I think if we get this wrong, if the government gets this wrong, which is no suggestion that it might, there are massive social and environmental consequences which will be very hard to put back together. There are, of course, economic circumstances to which other members have referred. But when we trace this particular issue to its source, it comes back to one very simple question, which is how do we address the stranglehold of the supermarkets over our dairy industry? Because what we are looking at is not the fault of farmers, it's not the fault of the planning system, it's not the fault of the government, it's actually the fault of supermarkets who are putting short-term gain at the top of its agenda at the risk of of putting the UK dairy industry either into a sort of terminal freefall or indeed simply exporting it. We need to impress upon the supermarkets, and I'm aware of a demonstration by Welsh farmers outside Asda. I said I wouldn't name a supermarket, but now I have, outside Asda in Chepstow tomorrow, which is going to be expressing this view. It is a sad day, I would suggest, Mrs. Reardon, when any section of the agricultural community is subject to this kind of pressure, because, as I say, the long-term and downstream consequences for the rural community as a whole are devastating unless we get this right.
Roger Gale.